I wanted to talk a little bit about my great-grandfather, Sam Axe. He came from a village in Poland called Lodz, or Łódź. That's how they pronounced it. It's Lodz. And I believe the name Axe comes from axle in Polish, which I believe they might have made axles for carts. I doubt it was for early vehicles, but it could have been. It was quite early. I think his family was really victims of some violent pogroms around the turn of the century. And I believe I found his father's grave in Łódź. And I believe he died in 1904, which of course threw the whole family into turmoil because his mother was then left with nothing except a lot of mouths to feed. And I believe his father, as I said, might have been killed in violence during the pogrom. So my great-grandfather and his brother Abraham just turned west, and they just started literally walking out of Poland any way they could. And the way I guess they ate or fed themselves was they were boxers. I think boxing was very big, I've said this before, in the turn of the century. And I think they boxed each other. I think they did exhibitions, or maybe other people. And it took quite a long time. My father said that he had spoken to him about it, and that he had said it took almost a year and a half to get from this town in Poland to Hamburg. And that's where he stayed until he could get the money to take a steamship, the Porsche, over from Hamburg to England. And I've told part of the story. I'm going to skip the part where he met and married my great-grandmother in the East End of London. And I'm going to tell you about a very unfortunate happening. I believe I misspoke earlier. And I'm going to have to look it up, but I think in 1907, he finally earned enough money to do what he always wanted to do, which was not only get to a safe country, but specifically the United States. That was his dream. And I really don't think he would have settled for anything else. He had his mind set on that. He was very much into automobiles. And, automobiles were just becoming available and popular. So he was really interested in that. So him and his brother got on a steamship called the Celtic, also a well-known steamship of the time. And I believe it was from Manchester to New York, to Ellis Island. And it was quite a long journey over for whatever reason. I mean, normally it didn't take that long, but it was maybe 10 days or more, maybe close to 12 days. And unfortunately, when he got to Ellis Island, his brother got in, but he was turned away because during the journey he had caught the chicken pox. And at that time, if you were undesirable in some way, had a disease, or from what I've been told, although I've heard conflicting reports about this, even if you were a pregnant woman sometimes, they would just send you back. And so because he legitimately straight up had a medical diagnosis, which was on the manifest from the report when he got to Ellis Island, and it says that he had the chickenpox. And the very next day, they put him right back on the Celtic for its return trip, and he had to go directly back. It's a good thing, because had he not gotten the chickenpox, I don't think I would be making this video, because of course then he had to go back to England, and that's when he met and married my great-grandmother. But I wanted to talk about epigenetic trauma. Epigenetic trauma is very interesting to me because it talks about inherited trauma. And, you know, of course, he had been very traumatized by the pogroms in his home country, and then losing his father, and then making this incredible journey, and then making another journey across the ocean, only to get to Ellis Island, to be turned right back. And fortunately, he was very strong and determined, and he got back again. Finally, in 1911, September, he got here to this country on my husband's birthday, September 18th, 1911. And he had kind of established an alias for himself, because he didn't want to be turned away again. And I think he had heard that incorrectly, that if you had come in and been turned away or kicked out, that you couldn't come in on the same name. Well, in the end, he didn't leave from Southampton and come into New York to Ellis Island. He left from Manchester and went into Philadelphia. So, of course, they didn't have computerized records, so they would have had no record of Sam Axe. And he came in, and then I have the manifest, and it's in his name, his own name. The interesting thing I wanted to talk about when he got to the U.S., of course, then he went through the trauma of trying to get his wife and baby over to the U.S. And it took a bit of time between September 18th and April, well, when he finally eventually saw them on the April the 22nd. So it took quite a while. So that was tough. And then, of course, thinking that his wife and his baby had died on the Titanic, and not knowing, because the third-class survivors' names were not transmitted for days. So finally, he did find out. And then when he went and got them, he found a very, very traumatized and changed young wife. And so he had to deal with that. And now he has an infant. And after 3 months, my grandmother was conceived. And the interesting thing about epigenetic trauma that I'm looking at is that at a cellular level, somehow an egg or a sperm can be altered due to trauma and stress. And as a result, cause ongoing problems for their descendants. That is one kind of epigenetic trauma that I want to look at, not to mention his trauma, but also her trauma was extraordinary. And of course, then my grandmother was conceived 3 months later. So I think there is, I definitely feel, and I've talked to some relatives who also feel that there is some long-term effects of this trauma that exist in our family. Not to mention, behaviorally, there can be inherited trauma. if you're so undermined and you can't really control your anxiety or your depression, or because of the trauma that you've been through, and you now have a newborn, that newborn is affected by your behavior and your lack of ability to get a hold of yourself. So, that's evidenced by the fact that when my grandmother was born, 11 months after the sinking of the Titanic, my great-grandmother was trying to tell the nurses a story, and instead of telling them she wanted my grandmother's name to be Sarah Carpathia, in honor of Captain Rostron of the Carpathia, who saved the Titanic survivors, somehow she must have been somewhat raving, and what they thought she wanted to name her daughter was Sarah Titanic Axe, which is what my grandmother's birth certificate says. So this shows a person who was really, truly, still very, very traumatized. And it makes me sad to think that that's who they handed my newborn baby grandmother over to, was a woman who was so traumatized. And that must have affected my grandmother deeply in many ways. And my grandmother's the one that raised my mother, and my mother's the one that raised me. And I'm interested in this from both angles, both at a cellular level, how my grandmother being conceived of 3 months after all of this, and then behaviorally, how my grandmother was affected by this. And therefore, my mother, my sister, and myself were affected. And so I am very interested in this. And when my great-grandfather got to the United States, eventually he went into the junk business. And eventually our family business was a junkyard in Norfolk, Virginia, 22nd Street. And his brother also was a junk peddler. In fact, this was a kind of popular profession. And if you look at our local telephone guide, it even lists my great uncle as his occupation was huckster, which did not have a negative connotation at that time, but was simply indicative of a person who recycled what other people didn't want to use and got it to people who did want to use it. So one thing that's interesting to me is I collect everything. It's very difficult for me to let anything go. And when I was doing my shoot with my husband this morning, it suddenly occurred to me, here I am with a Ziploc bag of all the empty bags of the 40 parts of the Lego that I've already built. Why am I keeping these? Why don't I just throw them out? This happens in so much of my life when I have a hard time throwing things out. But I'm, fortunate and have been fortunate, and I'm not lacking for anything, and yet I still feel this compulsion to save things. Big things, small things, insignificant things. And I wonder if this is some kind of leftover epigenetic trauma. One thing I wanted to add to this video was something that happened a few years ago when I had food allergy testing from a company called Alcat. And I was hoping just to find out if I had a sensitivity to gluten, maybe lactose intolerance, something like that. And when it came in the mail, I was pretty amazed and pretty overwhelmed to see that I was only really seriously allergic or sensitive to one thing, food related. Iceberg lettuce. Yeah. So I've attached a copy of it here for you to see.